For Paul Tillich, faith and doubt are not opposites. Instead, genuine faith includes an element of doubt, and honest doubt is never entirely without a spark of faith. This distinction is rooted in Tillich's unique definition of faith. He describes faith as a state of being ultimately concerned. What does this mean? We might understand an ultimate concern by comparing it with penultimate concerns or finite concerns. A finite concern might be something like our job, relationships, our material things, something that's finite, something that will eventually come to an end. These concern us, certainly, but they do not concern us ultimately, or at least they shouldn't. Instead, only God is rightfully called our ultimate concern. Thus, faith as trust is here understood as ultimate concern, meaning God is an infinite passion that we risk our very being on. So it is a concept of faith that is broader than faith as mere intellectual agreement or faith as a kind of feeling. Instead, faith here is an ultimate existential concern. God is then the symbol for what concerns us ultimately. And so there are a number of elements in this definition that I want to explore, and so bear with me as I unpack this concept. The first point to see with this is that by defining faith in this way, Tillich is suggesting that no one is without faith, because all human beings have something that concerns them ultimately. They might not call it God, but whatever it is that we stake our very existence and being on is what we would call an ultimate concern. And so even nihilism stakes its very being on the ultimate meaninglessness or the ultimate nothingness of a reality, but that is still something ultimate. You're making an ultimate claim, and that claim concerns you. And so a helpful aspect of this is how Tillich's doctrine of faith includes an inbuilt critique of idolatry. Because as Calvin said, the human heart is a factory of idols, and therefore we are prone to taking our finite concerns and making them into something ultimate, thus setting them in the place of God. For example, many people make money their ultimate concern in life, but money is a false idol. But Tillich would go further and suggest that money then is not only an idol for us, but it is a demonic force in our lives. That's Tillich's concept of the demonic. Tillich defines the demonic as anything finite that we wrongfully elevate up into the status of ultimacy. And so whenever we give something finite or penultimate the status of ultimacy and make it our ultimate concern, that becomes a demonic idol, a power that holds force over us in a negative way. And so any finite thing that is made ultimate is a demonic idol, whether that's a career, a political figure, or political movement, or even something good like a friend or a relationship or something that we enjoy. However, any finite reality that is exalted to the status of an ultimate concern is an idol. Only God is rightfully the true ultimate because only God transcends the limits of our finitude. And so God, as our ultimate concern, is liberating, whereas a finite concern that becomes ultimate is demonic and therefore harmful. But a true ultimate, when God is our true ultimate, that is a liberating and a healing moment for us, actually. And that's part of Tillich's understanding of salvation, is that salvation is healing. It's when God overcomes our estrangement. And so for Tillich, he understands God as the ground and power of being itself. And in another video, I will unpack that definition a little bit more in detail and what it means for Tillich's doctrine of God. But the point here is that God must be beyond essence and existence for God to rightfully be our ultimate concern. In other words, it's another way of saying that God transcends our finitude or that God is holy. And so where does doubt then come into this definition of faith? For Tillich, faith is a state of being grasped by an ultimate concern does not mean that we transcend our limitations and ourselves become somehow ultimate. We remain finite creatures living within our limited existence. Thus, we have an ultimate concern, we are grasped, rather, by an ultimate concern, yet we remain finite. And so we are always in this paradox between being finite and thus limited, yet being grasped by an ultimate concern. And so the paradox of faith then explains why Tillich thought that faith is ultimately a risk, because as finite beings, we cannot claim to know or grasp what is ultimate. The ultimate must grasp us. It must claim us, which is why faith is fundamentally a gift defined as a state of being grasped by an ultimate concern. And so faith is a gift of grace for us. It's not something we work up for ourselves. But there is always the risk of turning our finite concepts of God into an idol. And so theology itself can quickly become idolatry when the distinction between God and humanity is not retained fully enough. And so thus, in a broader sense, this paradox of faith means that there is no such thing as a faith that is entirely free from doubt. Because we remain human and thus finite, our being grasped by an ultimate concern is paradoxical and will always include this element of doubt. Likewise, Tillich suggests that all honest doubt involves doubt in an ultimate concern, and thus doubt can actually be a kind of confirmation of genuine faith. Tillich explains, quote, "Many Christians, as well as members of other religious groups, feel anxiety, guilt, and despair about what they call loss of faith. But serious doubt is confirmation of faith. It indicates the seriousness of the concern, its unconditional character." So for me, I find this to be quite a liberating concept of faith. I grew up in a semi-fundamentalist type of church where I was in a constant state of fear that I might lose my faith one day. But in that situation, doubt was seen as an enemy to be suppressed and rejected and resisted. But in Tillich's framework, doubt is actually a kind of sign of genuine faith, because it means that faith is not only an inherent risk for us, but it is also something that we take with unconditional seriousness, even if that includes an element of doubt. And in fact, the suppression of doubt, or the dishonest attempt at removing or pretending that it doesn't exist, is problematic because it attempts to turn faith into something we master ourselves rather than a gift of grace. Because if you think about it, this idea that we could suppress or entirely ignore doubt would no longer make us human. It would be dehumanizing, because it would mean we somehow have triumphed over our finitude within this reality, whereas it's only by receiving it by grace that we have this ultimate concern, or we're grasped by it, but we do not become something else. We remain finite. And so it also goes directly against the doctrine of justification by grace through faith. And so Tillich connects this concept with faith with the Reformation idea of justification, by suggesting that justification does not only include the justification of sinners, but also the justification of doubters. Tillich explains, "The principle of justification through faith refers not only to the religious ethical, but also to the religious intellectual life. The situation of doubt, even doubt about God, need not separate us from God. There is faith in every serious doubt." And so for those of you who perhaps, like me, grew up in a situation where losing one's faith was a constant worry, where it gave you anxiety and fear, I hope that this definition of faith can be a relief to you, because even your doubt is justified by faith. It is not an exclusionary thing. In fact, genuine faith is never without that element of doubt, because faith is received by finite people who take their concern ultimately, but they're still limited by their finitude. And so to try to remove all of the doubt from faith would be dehumanizing. It would be doing violence to ourselves. It would be a dishonest attempt to avoid our finitude and the reality that we are limited. We're not ultimate. We're grasped by an ultimate concern, but we're still limited people. And so I think there's something deeply compassionate and sympathetic in this definition of faith, and it's one of the things I admire the most about Tillich's theology. Tillich is then quite a helpful figure for people who have gone through seasons of deconstruction or who might identify as exvangelical. Deconstruction in this sense might actually be a sign that your faith is deepening, not that it's weakening. And that's because you have more honestly been able to embrace the ambiguities of your faith and the risk that's involved in claiming that God is your ultimate concern, and that always entails an element of doubt. And so I find this approach really helpful and liberating, and I hope it's something that you can find helpful and liberating as well. Because I hope you know that however much you feel rejected by, let's say, your former church, your former community, because maybe you started questioning a particular doctrine about God, or you started questioning the doctrine of atonement, you started questioning various other doctrines that are considered essential to faith for certain churches, and maybe that makes you feel ostracized by your community, or maybe you've left at this point because of your faith exploration. But Tillich is emphatic about the fact that faith is not intellectual agreement. It's not about checking the boxes. Faith is an existential trust, a risking your very self on the ultimacy of your concern, which is the ultimacy of God. And so if that's faith, then an element of doubt always is going to come into play. And so this idea that doubting a particular doctrine is a sign that you're no longer a Christian, or when, for example, these sort of heresy hunters, right, exist in the world that go around and say, well, this person denies this doctrine, or they deny whatever else. They're not really a real Christian. They're not a true Christian in the sense, that operates with a fundamental misunderstanding of what faith is. Faith truly is this existential sense of trust in an ultimate concern. And because it's a trust as a human, it's inherently a risk. And so we are finite people, and it's dishonest to claim that we have mastery over ultimate things such as God or religion. And a lot of times this kind of dogmatic orthodoxy comes into play when you attempt to grasp onto our dogmas or our orthodoxy even, and to make that ultimate. That would be, in Tillich's idea of faith, that would be a false idol. That would be a demonic idol. To take, let's say, my particular doctrine of what God is like, and to say that that's ultimate, that to misidentify that with who God is, that then becomes a demonic idol. And so Tillich's idea opens up a little bit more freedom, but it also is quite liberating in that regard. It's a powerful way of critiquing idolatry, particularly the versions of it that still exist even within Christian spaces. And so Tillich was often emphatic to emphasize the non-objectifiability of God, the idea that God cannot become an object that we master. So God must be beyond our best conceptualizations of God. He says elsewhere that God transcends God's own name. And so that's an essential component of this idea of faith, that it protects the godness of God and the humanity of the person who is in that situation of faith. And so Tillich's concept of faith draws us back to a better understanding of faith, where it's not just intellectual agreement, but it's truly a state of being grasped by God as our ultimate concern. And so if you want to read more about Tillich's idea of faith, I recommend his short book called The Dynamics of Faith. It's a pretty easy read, and it covers a lot of these same things I've talked about here. I've also written a book recently about Tillich. It's this one here, shameless plug for it, but I try in this book to explain Tillich clearly, to analyze a few of his key ideas that I think are important. I go through many of the main points in his systematic theology, and so if you're curious, you may also be interested in checking that out. So both of those books will be in the description. But for now, let me just say thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have a good day.